It's sometimes hard to tell that this Sunday, this first Sunday after Thanksgiving, is the marker of the real beginning of the season to celebrate the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, also we know as Jesus Christ. And the gifts and the decorations and the Santas and the carols and even Black Friday sales started earlier this year while there was still Halloween candy on the shelves. It was earlier than usual because of the coronavirus pandemic and stores' concerns about people really coming out on Black Friday and wanting to get all the business they could for as long as they could. Do you remember when I was a kid, when 4 weeks was plenty of time to be anticipating Christmas? In fact, as a kid and a young person, it was too much. But 4 weeks was just about right. I think the church was very wise in setting aside that amount of time. Advent is a tradition that I came to rather late in my life. Advent wreaths and calendars weren't part of either my family's habits growing up, nor were they particularly emphasized that I recall in the Salvation Army that I attended as a kid. The Salvation Army was very, very busy at that time of year, collecting money to do the charitable works that they do the whole year long. And like all of the adults and teens, and even some of the kids in that community, we were all out, sometimes more than once a week, at Christmas kettles near the Kresge 5 and 10 cent store not far from my house in Chicago. Hour after hour, we donned not our gay apparel, but our winter clothes and coats and stood out by the kettles ringing the bell in hopes that there would be enough money to meet at least some of the needs of those who had less than we did in our community. Preparing for the birth of Jesus was not a time of reflection or fasting, as I think the church in its long ago wisdom recommended. We were not very patiently waiting for the birth of Christ to come. By my mid-20s, however, I gave not a single thought to anything that some would refer to as the meaning of the season. Xmas was just fine with me. The holiday season, both growing up and throughout most of my adult life, early adult life, was about remembering family and friends. The holiday season was about gifts and our cards that were exchanged. And remember, well, some of us still do them occasionally, those newsy, braggy family letters that you send in your Christmas cards that some were so annoying. And as sending mail, snail mail has become less and less common, I'm afraid to say, miss. We made our gift lists and we brought out the ornaments, as some of you were talking about, decorated trees, all of the usual kinds of things that we did in my house as a more, I guess, mindful celebration of the birth of Jesus. But now they really reflected different things for me. The Christmas decorations in particular, I sat down with and carefully unpacked them year after year. My daughter's preschool clothespin and cotton ball snowman that we stuck on the tree. And I had a homemade ornament that every year reminded me of a child that was in one of my third grade classes, because that kid's mother brought me this beautiful little square red and green needlepoint ornament. And she brought it to me in a paper bag because the school had sent out a notice to parents that they were discouraging parents and children bringing Christmas gifts for teachers because it was the gift giving had gotten way out of hand. she took the policy so literally. She didn't wrap it up, but put it in a paper bag to be able to hand it to me with whispering that she knows she wasn't supposed to do that. So my Xmas tree was trimmed with Christmas memories. Well, that was the kind of relationship I had with Christmas for decades. It was food, it was getting together with people and decorating and other things, shopping for sure. And that persisted, my attitude persisted until it became my duty to preach a Christmas sermon from a UU pulpit every Christmas for another couple decades. It may be strange, and I often back, especially early in my ministry, thought it was strange that we had Christmas and, of course, Easter Unitarian Universalists, because they certainly weren't otherwise in evidence in my congregations, either the ones I was a member of or the ones I served. Or if people were Christian with a C, little c, or a big C, they kept very quiet about it. It was a don't ask, don't tell sort of thing. So when I was hired, I guess, for my first pulpit, for my first church, I was taken aback when it was explicitly written into my learning serving contract with the congregation that I would be responsible for a Christmas Eve service. Well, okay, what am I going to do with this? This Xmas Unitarian Universalist. Well, the first couple of years, I lumped all the winter holidays together into one service and called it lights or seasons or something. And it was all about Christmas, and then maybe a little Hanukkah thrown in, and maybe Diwali would be mentioned, and certainly the solstice. And for a couple of years there, it seemed like diluting Christmas somehow made it less challenging for me and maybe for my UU congregations. But all this time, there was an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room was, of course, Jesus. And furthermore, my ambivalence about Jesus, having been in the background of my life, pushed way back in a corner, not attended to for many decades, since I was a teenager, really, I put aside all the questions about who Jesus was. But Christmas after Christmas, Advent after Advent, they would come back up. Who was Jesus? And why was I so reluctant to take a look? And so each year, faced with this same dilemma year after year, I looked for a little more of an answer. And it seems that as I looked, I found out that people have always done that. Ever since Jesus' birth, people have tried to figure out who he is. What is his identity? Now, I guess I had been exposed mainly to people who knew, or at least they thought they knew who Jesus was. There were theologians I read in seminary, TV preachers, obscure and famous ones. There were neighbors who wanted me to go to their church, who were just sure I needed Jesus Christ in my life, though I'm not sure I'm not sure I understood who that Jesus really was. There were family members, my mother, for instance, who had become a Christian, and she would testify to an intimate knowledge of Jesus that she prayed to. But when I started looking on this annual quest, I found out that it wasn't so easy to know who Jesus was, despite what people thought they knew. Because it turns out that when you get down to really looking for it, there isn't much that we know about Jesus. He was a real person, maybe born around the 6th century before the Christian era, maybe in Nazareth, maybe not. He was baptized by one known as John, who was a zealot, a Jewish zealot who wanted to reform Judaism. We have an idea that Jesus traveled in Galilee, in Jerusalem, maybe other places, but for sure in Galilee and Jerusalem. And he did that for about 3 years. He's preaching about a new and better form of Judaism, one that lived, and he lived, more importantly, the important Jewish commandment, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And then Jesus added, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that, Jesus said, was all the commandments and all the law. That was all that the center, the core of preaching. And if you had that, you had Jewish faith. So there's also some evidence Jesus had brothers. He may have been a carpenter, although no one knows for sure. When he was about 33 years old or so, Jesus was arrested by the local governor and representative of the Roman Empire, and he was sentenced to die by crucifixion, and he did. That's Jesus' biography. And the rest, all of the rest, is theology. The sayings, the stories, and miracles attributed to Jesus were talked about and shared after his death. But it turns out that all of the stories found in the Bible, and even very few other sources, including all the reports of the sightings of him after his death, would hardly amount to much. Mostly they're legends and myths. So Jesus was hardly unique. He had a very sketchy life and time in his times. And there were lots of other miracle workers around that time as well, who were believed by some group of followers or others to be divine. And we don't even remember most of them. We know they existed, and a few are named here and there. Theologians and historians, I came to find out, aren't sure if we'd even remember Jesus at all if it weren't for one important interpreter of him. Paul believed firmly that Jesus was literally the Son of God and the only bearer of salvation. Some say with good reason that Paul invented Christianity. Jesus didn't have that anyone can determine from any of the sayings that may be genuine or maybe apocryphal, that he was more than just a rabbi or a prophet. Paul, it turns out, never met Jesus, and he almost never quotes Jesus, which was kind of a revelation to me because those letters were so revered when I was a practicing Christian. He tells none of Jesus' stories or parables or sayings. All of those are in the Gospels. And all those letters that Paul wrote have turned out to be the basis of Christianity. And they were all written 15, 20 years after Jesus' death. The only who that Paul was interested in, it turns out, was the Jesus who came to him in a vision and he believed offered everlasting life through faith in this person. In other words, he spiritualized the all too human Jesus. Now, Paul's Jesus was also my Jesus during the early part of my life. I believed John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I have it written down on my paper here just in case, but I think I'll never totally erase it from my memory, even though I don't believe that anymore. And I haven't for a very, very long time. But over these years, these last couple of decades of my life, I found I'm increasingly not satisfied with being an Xmas person either. And so I have revisited my beliefs about Jesus year after year, and I still do. That's what Advent is for me, this season of light, another opportunity to go back and reflect on who Jesus was, and maybe more importantly, is Jesus have any meaning to me now? And I find that when I do this about this time every year and spend just a little time during Advent reflecting on it, a couple of things have become clear to me. Going back and thinking about this story of Jesus' birth allows me to revisit a sense of awe and wonder, something that I long for and don't often pay attention to, even though it's around me all the time. The Advent season reminds me of one of my strongest core beliefs, is that our lives, that life, every life is precious, and every life carries within it such amazing possibilities. Yes, Jesus' life was just one among many. And because of extraordinary circumstances and people like Paul and lots of other things, his life was believed to be somehow supernatural. But I can go back and look at that history and say, yes, this was an extraordinary man in extraordinary times that influenced many legions, if you will, to a better and a different life. And that still inspires me. Now, if I try to tell this to some of my friends and family members, and my mother, I can't argue with her anymore except virtually in some sort of spiritual seance kind of way. So if I told my mother this is what I understand about Jesus, she would have been horrified, because she would say to me that if you're going to believe anything about Jesus, you have to believe the whole thing. That what's important about Jesus is that he was the Christ. He was the only one incarnation of God. And there are people today, maybe some in your life, who might tell you that same thing. They might say, you can't take the parts of this story, of this person's life, and only take what appeals to you and just put aside the rest, confessing your sins and being forgiven and longing for eternal life. And that stopped me for a long time from even considering that perhaps I needed to revisit my relationship with Jesus. And then finally one day I said, well, why not? Why can't I take what I want and leave the rest? Isn't that what we do? And isn't that what Jesus' followers have always done? To his disciples, if you go back and read the Gospels, Jesus was a Messiah. He was sent by God, not necessarily to take away the sin of the world, but to renew the Jewish faith. Of course, to the Jews, the Jewish leaders in his time, Jesus was a false prophet. And to the Romans, he was a dangerous revolutionary. And to Paul, he was the one who came to atone for his sins. So all Jesus' followers have ever said about him and his life has not been about Jesus. Clearly not about Jesus. It's really about them. Whether it was in the first century or during Luther's time, during the Reformation, or even last year, people build layer upon layer of proof that Jesus is the Jesus they need him to be. You could say, and some have, that Jesus is a cosmic screen upon which people project their deepest longings and their needs. And I stand as a Unitarian Universalist in a long tradition of other Unitarian Universalists who have done exactly that. Not by rejecting Jesus as irrelevant, meaningless, unimportant, but as Jesus who had something to say to his time and perhaps ours. Today, I don't know how many Unitarian Universalists are even aware that our roots as Unitarians and as Universalists are very deep in Christianity, deep in faith and doctrine, deep in a belief that Jesus was somehow divine, a manifestation of God, God's love at least, on this earth. May not have been the Son of God, divine in that eternal, existing, whatever the creed says about him, but Jesus was more than. I don't know how many people, I'd like a survey, but Unitarian Universalists aren't into surveys these days. We seem to be off on entirely other tangents. Ones I'm a little worried about, but it's a sermon for another day. When religious humanism captured our attention a century ago or more or less, Jesus, whatever that specialness that early Unitarians and Universalists believed about him, was transformed into Jesus is just another human being, maybe a little bit better than most of us in terms of his morals and ethics, but just another human being. And today, if I were to guess about such a survey, Jesus would be just an irrelevant historical footnote in Unitarian Universalism. What does all this mean as we begin this Christmas season? Well, for me, wrestling with Jesus' identity has been an interesting exercise. Maybe it would be for you too, or maybe it has been for you. Maybe that would be a fruitful conversation someday. I'd love to hear how you either knew nothing about Christianity or Jesus ever, or that you had and you've come to a different or maybe even the same understanding. But the question isn't so much who Jesus is for you as what Jesus has or could offer you. What does Jesus mean? Well, as I said, at Christmas time, Jesus is a reminder of my need for awe and wonder, to not forget to savor the time. I wonder at his humble beginnings and his profound and far-reaching life. I'm moved by Jesus' example of welcoming everyone at the table, men and women, children, the poor, the wealthy, the sinner, the one too unclean to be touched, the one not religious enough. I need Jesus' vision of empires and of power that's limited, not limited, power that's shared, the understanding that might does not make right, which I believe he preached and lived. And I need to hear Jesus' truth, that the last will come into their own and that the lost will be found. And hope doesn't die, even when it's out of sight for a while. All of these are renewals of my faith. Could they come from other sources? Of course, they can and they do. But there's so much richness in the spirit of Jesus that I come back to again and again. I think as many people do, and I believe that the religion of Jesus, perhaps not the religion of Jesus, about Jesus, but of Jesus, to get it straight, persists because there is so much richness there for us if we take just a short time, maybe just during this season, to touch it again. So that's what I hope for you this time.